So that's Acts 17. And we'll pick up the reading in verse 14, I think. So Acts 17, verse 14. And we'll read down into the chapter, finishing at the last verse. Okay, so we're looking at Paul tonight. And we'll do so by thinking about Paul when he's in Athens. And we'll pick the reading up from Acts 17 and verse 14. Then immediately the brethren sent Paul away, that's away from Berea, to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there in Berea. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come with him, with all speed, they departed. And so while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. And some said, "What does this babbler seem to say?" Others said that he seems to be proclaiming foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know which this new doctrine is of which you speak. For you are bringing some strange things to our attention. Therefore we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and their foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their nations, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly, these times of ignorance God has overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, while others said, "We will hear you again on this matter." So Paul departed from them. However, some men joined him and believed, among them Dionysius the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So I wonder how many of you remember looking at Paul. I was thinking that it might have been last year, but it's probably the year before, 2018. We started a study of the Apostle Paul, and we began by looking at what Paul says about himself in Galatians, chapter 1 especially. We then sort of quickly went across to Philippians and we took a look at him there. And then we came to Acts and we started to think about the life of the Apostle Paul as we find it in Acts. And I think we got as far as looking at Paul in Philippi. So what I want us to do then is just move things along a little bit and take another look at the Apostle Paul. And then when we open this up for discussion, let's see how much we remember about the Apostle Paul from 2 years ago. So let's take up the story then with Paul in Berea. So we're in Acts 17, and first of all, Paul goes to Thessalonica, and he's very successful in establishing a church there. And he's there for maybe weeks or possibly just a few months, and he has to flee for his life, and he flees to Berea. And in Berea, he finds the people there more reasonable, more willing to engage with his message, to search the scriptures, to see whether Paul was speaking accurately. But then people from Thessalonica came down to Berea, and Paul once again had to flee for his life. And it seems as if some of the people of Berea took Paul secretly to the port and put him on a ship, and he came to Athens. Now he arrives at Athens and he's on his own there. Silas and Timothy are still in Berea, and Paul is waiting for them. And so he's on his own in this great capital city, this great place of learning and culture and philosophy, this place that's the birth of democracy. He's there and he's on his own. And what he does initially, you get the sense from what he says in verses 22 and 23. What he does is what anybody would do, and he plays the tourist. So he looks around the city of Athens. Now, I've not been. Some of you may have been, and you can still see some of the sites that Paul saw, changed obviously. So he's initially the tourist. And then what he does his usual thing. He goes to the synagogues, and in the synagogues, he starts to discuss and debate with the Jews who live in Athens and those God-fearers. Do you remember them? God-fearers are people who have been attracted to the Jewish religion. What they are attracted by above anything else is monotheism, that there is one God. So do you remember now, the Roman world has many gods, the Greek world had many gods, but where the Jews are scattered, they attract people with their declaration that there is one God. So God-fearers are those who are drawn to this idea of God. So you see then in verses 16 and 17 that he is initially doing what he's done before in every other place. On the Sabbath day in the synagogue, he's reasoning. So do you remember what we have said about Paul? Paul doesn't start something new. Paul sees that the Old Testament is fulfilled in Christ. So the great revelation for Paul was that Jesus is the great hope, the Messiah, the God of the Old Testament. And so he believes the Old Testament completely. He's Jewish and he's found his hope in Christ. And that's what he speaks about in the synagogue. And then what Paul does is he goes to the marketplace. So take a look at verse 17. And he goes there every day. And he just strikes up conversations with whoever happens to be there. And it's this this Greek tradition that you would exchange ideas in the marketplace. And Luke comments on that, doesn't he, in verse 21. And you can't read verse 21 really without getting a sense of the contempt that Luke has for the Athenians. He sees them as self-indulgent, lazy. He sees them as bored, waiting for the newest idea listening to the latest trend, looking for the newest fad. This is his contempt for Athenian society. And it's very clear in verse 21. Let's take a look at that verse. For all the Athenians, now that's an exaggeration, for all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Now, I'm sure you can pick up the acid tone of Luke. You know, he's exaggerating all Athenians. He then mentions the foreigners, the barbarians who have settled in Athens, not the Jews now. And then he says, doesn't he? They spent their time in nothing else. That's where the sarcasm is found. Nothing else but looking for something new. And what Luke is doing there is he's emphasizing the decadence of Roman culture. They're a bit like times in our history where people have just looked for the latest fad and been taken up with the newest idea. So Luke is very contemptuous of the Athenians. Now, what happens then is as Paul is in the marketplace, he comes to the attention of the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers. So come on, take a deep breath. We're going to have to talk about who these guys are. Who are the Epicureans and who are the Stoics? Because they are the ones whom Paul annoys with his ideas. And so what you have in this account is Paul being placed on trial by the Epicureans and the Stoics. We don't have here a sermon. We don't even have Paul giving an evangelistic talk. This is a trial. So Paul is on trial here. And when we forget that, we make no sense of Acts 17. As a minister, I would say to you, I have heard more sermons and more nonsense spoken on Acts 17 than any other passage in the New Testament. I mean, out of all the books of the New Testament, the book that is least understood is the book of Acts. And the passage that is most abused from the book of Acts is Acts 17. And there's been such nonsense spoken about it. And the greatest nonsense spoken about Acts 17 is that Paul is giving us a model of how to preach a sermon, a model of how to evangelize, a model of how to reach people. Well, he's doing nothing of the kind. Paul is on trial, and this is Paul's defense. Now, we are used to the idea of Paul being on trial. We have the prison epistles, and I'm sure you know what they are. Then we have Paul's second imprisonment when he writes the pastoral epistles. But we often forget that those weren't the only times when Paul was on trial. He was on trial on a number of occasions, and this is one of them. So this Areopagus thing that we've got here is a trial that Paul is called to do. So who's put a charge against Paul? And the charge against him comes from the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers. And you can see the charge they bring against Paul. Now, where is the charge? So you've got the text in front of you. Where is the charge that they are bringing against the Apostle Paul? Do you see it? So let's take a look at verse 18. So certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. So there's a chance element there. And they came and said, who does this babbler, or rather, what does this babbler want to say? Now, the word babbler, you may have it translated differently. It means somebody who sows seed in a random, sort of meaningless way. Some people want to convince you that the word babbler means a chicken who goes around pecking seed. So they've got contempt for this man, Paul. Just as Luke has contempt for them, they have contempt for Paul. So there they are then, they're saying, what does he want to say? And then others said, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods. Now that is the charge that they make against Paul. That Paul has come to Athens and he is advocating, proclaiming, propagating foreign gods. And as you go on in verse 18, do you see that they accuse Paul of introducing two new foreign gods? And those two new gods, one is called Jesus, and the other is called Anastasia, a female word which we translate as resurrection, but it's the name Anastasia is from the two Greek words Anna, which means up again or again, and which means to stand. So the word means to stand again or to stand up again. And these two philosophy schools are accusing Paul of introducing a new divine couple, Jesus and Anastasia. And this new divine couple are linked by these two groups of philosophers to Isis and Osiris, the Greek Egyptian divine couple. So the charge is that they are introducing this to Athens. Now, why is that such a bad thing? Well, if you take a look at that phrase, the charge now in verse 18, he is a proclaimer of foreign gods. That phrase was dynamite in Athens. And it was dynamite in Athens because of one man. There was one man in their history, possibly the most famous man in their history, someone whose fame continues to our day. This one famous man was also put on trial. And the reason why this famous, perhaps the most famous of all philosophers, even though we don't have any of his writings, this famous philosopher was put on trial in Athens for proclaiming foreign gods. And this had happened 200 maybe years earlier. It was seen as a terrible travesty and utter catastrophe that the Athenians did this. And even centuries later, in Paul's day, the horror of what they did to this philosopher continues. And so that phrase, "he's the proclaimer of foreign gods," would have had such an emotional and powerful impact for the Athenians because of their history. So this previous guy, great philosopher, was put on trial, found guilty, sentenced to death. And whilst he was waiting for the death penalty, when he was in prison, he famously ended his life. He drank hemlock. Who's that, guys? Who are we talking about? Well, I'm not going to tell you. Okay, we'll talk about it later. But the point I'm making is that this continues, even to Paul's day, to have huge significance for the Athenians. And so they now put Paul into that same category. Here is a Jewish man coming in among us, talking about a divine couple we've never heard of before, Jesus and Anastasia. And he is advocating these gods that do not belong to our Parthenon, our pantheon, or the Roman pantheon. So, who are these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers? Now, there we go. You never thought you'd be doing philosophy on a Monday night. So, first of all, let's have the Epicureans. Now, these guys said that whether there's one God or many gods, their big idea was God has nothing to do with the world. There is no relationship between God or the gods and the world in which we live. The world in which we live is just made up of atoms, and yes, everyone, they thought up of atoms. The world is just made up of atoms. This world is all there is. When you die, and that's the end of it. So the Epicureans said, this life is all that there is. So you eat and you drink and you get merry because that's all there is. There is nothing after. And as for the gods, they're unknown. They're in their own world. They're indifferent to us. They have no interest in us at all. They just do their thing and we do our thing. That's the Epicureans. Now, they said, when you die, you die. Your body kind of disintegrates, the energies change, but that's it. Now, is it interesting then how they picked up on the word resurrection? Because for the Epicureans, this life was all there was. That's the Epicureans. Now, the Stoics, they said, no, there are gods, but the gods live inside of us. So they were pantheists. God lives in everyone. There's the divine spark in every human, in every creature, and this divine spark lives within us, and it's like fire, and it's like energy. And they were saying that God is within. So there is no separate God who is distinct. There is no God who exists in himself. Instead, there's this spark in everyone. The divine spark lives in all living things. And it's like fire. It energizes us. And the Stoics, then they taught that life was a continual cycle. So if you like, history goes through cycles. And it ends in fire and ashes and dust. And then like the phoenix, it rises up and there's a new cycle. And that just repeats the old cycle. And everything goes round and round and round and round and round. And that's going to go on forever. That's the Stoics. Now, if you kind of think about that for a moment, look at what Paul is saying. So to the Epicureans, who says that the gods are indifferent, they don't care, they've got nothing to do with us. What does Paul say to them in Acts 17? And to the Stoics, who say God lives within us all, and history is a continuous repetitive cycle of rise and fall, fire and dust, that goes round and round and round, forever repeating. What does he say to them? So his entire speech, his entire defense, whilst he's on trial, is directed against the Epicureans and the Stoics, because they are the guys who bring a charge against him. They are offended by what Paul has been saying. And so all that Paul says is directed to them. Now, let's take a look at what Paul says then. And what I want you to kind of think about as we look at what Paul says, keep in mind these two types of philosophies. Now, I know you might be bored to death with what these philosophers are saying, but Luke has identified them. Now, don't forget, you've got to engage faithfully with the biblical text. So if Luke is identifying the Epicureans and the Stoics as the ones who bring an accusation against Paul, then you've just got to keep that in mind. There's no way you can ignore that or wash over it or pretend Luke hasn't said it, because those two schools of philosophy are entirely the reason for what Paul goes on to say. So guys, whether you're bored stiff with philosophy or not, you just can't get away from it in Acts 17. So everything that Paul says is directed against these two schools. And I want you to notice the themes, okay? And when you see the themes, you get an exact idea of what Paul is doing. So let's take a look. So Paul's defense then. Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious." So he sees straight away then that he's on trial for a religious reason. "As I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you." This is a defense about the nature of God. Now, remember what I've told you. The Epicurean said the gods are unknown. The gods are indifferent. The gods are separate from us. There is no connection between the gods and us. Paul steps forward and says, you don't know God. My defense is a proclamation to you of the God of whom you are ignorant. Now, the key word, people, is ignorant. Okay? And you've got it there. Him whom you worship without knowing. The Greek is him of whom you are ignorant. Now go down to the end of Paul's defense, and what word you come across again? Okay, just look down and you see that there again, at the close of Paul's speech, he makes a reference to ignorance. Can you see it? These times of ignorance God has overlooked. Verse 30. Paul, in his defense, is going to focus on God, and he's going to accuse the Epicureans and the Stoics of ignorance, being without wisdom. Now you imagine doing that in the capital city of wisdom, in the very cradle of wisdom, in the very birthplace of wisdom and philosophy. He accuses his accusers of ignorance. And he's going to set them right on the true nature of God. This God who they either think is outside or is some spark within. Let me tell you, says Paul, who God is and what God has done. And that's what you get in this defense. So the first thing that Paul wants you to understand is he's going to put these right on the true nature of the relationship of God to the world. That's his defense. So remember, the Epicurean says there's no relationship between gods and the world. The Stoics say the divine spark is in us all. So Paul says, no, this is the true relationship of God to the world. And the first thing he wants to tell you about the relationship between God and the world is that God is the creator of the world. Now, the Epicureans didn't believe that, neither did the Stoics, because the Stoics didn't see a personal God. It was just like a divine influence. So Paul puts them right. And so you can see then God, verse 24, and look at how he declares it. It's a bit like Hebrews 1. God, who in various times and in various ways in times past, it's got that feel to it. It's a declaration. God, says Paul. Let me put you right on who God is. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Now, so here's the first thing. God is the creator of all things. He's not somebody who lives within temples. That is a swipe against the Stoics. The divine spark lives within us. We are the temples of the divine spark. No, says Paul. God doesn't live within anything. He doesn't live within us. He doesn't live within buildings. He doesn't live within images. He doesn't live within metals. God does not live within anything. But neither can you say to the Epicureans that God is indifferent. He's the creator of heaven and earth. So there he is. It's 1-0 to Paul against both the Stoics and the Epicureans in the very first opening verses. Then go down to see what he says. Verse 25. Nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives life to all, breath, and all things. Now, who is he taking a swipe against there? He gives life, he says, to all, breath and all things. Well, he's giving a swipe against both the Epicureans and the Stoics. Remember now, the Epicureans, God doesn't care, the gods are indifferent. No, says Paul, he gives life to all. He gives breath to all. And again, the Stoics, oh, it's a divine spark within us. No, says Paul, God is outside of us, giving us life, giving us breath. He's the one who sustains us all. So by the time you get to that verse, it's 2-0 to the Apostle Paul as he swipes against the Stoics and the Epicureans. Verse 26. He is made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has predetermined the appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord. Now here is almost, it's not quite, but it's almost his killer blow. Because what Paul is saying is this: against the ignorance of the Epicureans and the Stoics, he is saying that this God, who has made everything and given life to everything, wants everyone to know him. Now, this is fundamental. Paul's defense is this God wants to be known. And that's just utterly amazing. Because remember now, I know I'm boring you. The Epicurean says, no, you can't know these gods. The Stoics, but it's just a spark within you. No, says Paul, God is the creator. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He's the one who sustains everyone. And he is the God who wants to be known. And he wants all men to know him. And right throughout the ages of men, he has wanted men and women to know him. And there is another swipe against their ignorance. These wise and learned men are once more being accused by Paul of not knowing what they're talking about, because this God wishes to be known. And so Paul is saying that God has created all, verse 27, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. And there's the tragedy of human history. If you want to sum up human history in one line, there you have it. The tragedy of separation from God, ignorance of God, even though he's not far from any one of us. There's this great gulf between the God who wishes to be known and human inability to know him. And every attempt to build a temple, to raise an altar, to put a shrine together, is another failure to know the God who wants to be known, the God who desires to be known, and the tragedy of human failure to know him. And that's right at the heart of Paul's defense. This is the tragedy of Athens. It's the tragedy of Rome. It's the tragedy of our own culture, that this God who is not far from any of us, we cannot find him. Even though we make every attempt and we seek and we search, we cannot. And that is a beautiful, amazing description of the tragedy of human experience. And here's Paul laying it out in his defense. And he says, for in him we live and move and have our being. Who's that a swipe against? In him we live and move and have our being. So is it the Epicureans or the Stoics? Well, he goes to quote one of their own philosophers here. And if you knew the philosopher, and I can never pronounce his name, then you'd know whether he's having a swipe here against the Epicureans or the Stoics. But go to the phrase again. In him we live and move and have our being. Not in us the spark lives. In us the spark is. In us there's the spark of divine life. Now, which group said that? That the divine spark is in every one of us? That's the Stoics. So Paul quotes a Stoic philosopher to say, you're ignorant. You've got it entirely the wrong way around. It's not that the divine spark lives in us. It's that us, we live in God. In him we live. Not in us he lives. In him we live. He sustains us. He upholds us because he is the God who is separate from us and yet near to us. That's Paul, I think it's 4-0 now, is it? Against the Stoics. Let's see what happens next. For we all are his offspring. There's the quote of one of their own poets. And then you have, therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature, now Paul doesn't talk about the divine nature normally, okay? That's not the kind of phrases he uses. So this isn't an evangelistic sermon. This isn't addressed to Christians. This is Paul talking about the true nature of God against both these groups. The divine nature, where's the verse? Therefore, verse 29, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art or men's devising. Truly, there it is again now, verse 30, these times of ignorance. This is Paul's great defense here. You are ignorant. And God's overlooked that until now. These times of ignorance God has overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. Now, Paul is giving you here the biblical understanding of history. Human history is linear. It goes in a line. And human history one day will end. There's an end point to the line. So who's he having a swipe against, guys? Is it the Epicureans or is it the Stoics? Which is the one who said, all history is circular, goes round and around and around. History is fire and ashes and phoenix rising, and then fire and ashes and phoenix rising, and round and round and round it goes, ever repeating. Which group said that? Do you remember? Hands up if you were paying attention. It's the Stoics. So that great line that God has appointed a day on which he will judge the world is 5-0 to Paul against the Stoics. No, he says, you're ignorant. Human history isn't an ever-repeating cycle. Human history is linear. It's going forwards to one day. When that day comes, history will end, and it's a day of judgment and justice and righteousness. That's the day that human history will end. And it's going to end with one man whom God has appointed, this one man who will judge the world in righteousness. So verse 31, what's the last thing Paul's going to say in his defense? So he's demolished the case against him because he has shown the failures of the Epicureans and the Stoics. He's demolished their understanding of the nature of God. And what's the last thing he does? He says, you've even got it wrong. In accusing me of introducing two new gods, Jesus and the resurrection, you've just shown how ignorant you are. Because the resurrection isn't a God. The resurrection is God's proof of the man whom he has appointed to judge the world in righteousness. So at the end of verse 31, he has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is God's declaration to everyone that Jesus is the man whom God has chosen to end all history. Jesus will bring everything to an end. All the ignorance of God, all the failed attempts to know God, all the hand-built structures that men raise in their ignorance. God has appointed a day when one man will bring that all to an end. And that one man is Jesus Christ. And the proof is in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that, says Paul, is what I've been telling you. So the resurrection is proof of God's choice of Jesus. Verse 32, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Now, which one is that, guys? Which would be the mockers here? Remember, the ones who said this life is all it is? You can't know the gods. You can't have anything afterwards. This is all it is. It's just atoms floating around in the universe, crashing into one another. That's all life is. Who were they? They were the Epicureans. So, verse 32, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Well, that would be the Epicureans then, largely mocking. And then you've got, while others said, we will hear you again on this matter. And there's very strong evidence to believe that that would have been some of the Stoics. So Paul departed from among them. Paul was acquitted. And Paul leaves Athens. Now, what you need to also remind yourself is, Paul doesn't establish a church in Athens, as far as we know. He's been in the synagogues. He's been reasoning with the Jews and the God-fearers. And I think we had some idea that, he was getting somewhere. But there's no church at Athens like there is at Thessalonica or Corinth, to which he's going next. What do you make of that then? That there's no Athenian Christian church? But what we get is this in verse 34. However, some men joined him and believed, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite. Well, he would have been a judge. So he would have been one of the ones who would have heard Paul's trial, Paul's defense, Paul's apologia, his apology, this thing that we've just looked at. Dionysius would have heard that. And it's very likely that Dionysius then moves to acquit Paul. And when you read that he believes, either he believes his testimony or he believes in Christ, in the resurrection. So there's him, and then there's Damaris. Take a look at her then as we end. Among them was Dionysius and a woman named Damaris and others with them. Now, who was she? What was a woman doing at a trial? Did she have a role, or was she just an onlooker? Why do we have these two named and the others are not named? Because as you can see at the end of verse 34, and others with them. Now, why doesn't Luke tell us who they are? And what happens to them? What happens to Dionysius and Damaris, especially when you think there is no church at Athens? So here is Paul on trial, proclaiming the true nature of God and his relationship with the world, his relationship with human beings, his relationship with time. That's what Paul is declaring here in his defense. And he leaves and he trundles off to Corinth. So there you go.